Two brides stepped off the same stagecoach, both claiming the same man as their husband-to-be, and by the time the truth came out, one of them would be walking away with more than just a broken heart. Montana Territory, 1882. Dust rose in the golden light as Luke Carver, a hardened cattleman who'd built his ranch with blood and grit, watched the stagecoach approach, expecting the woman whose letters had softened his lonely nights. But when two women descended, each holding his name and his promise, the frontier's silence turned electric. One carried tenderness in her eyes, the other ambition sharp as a knife. Both had risked everything to come west, and neither intended to leave without him. In a land where reputation could be ruined by sunset and salvation could be found before dawn, Luke would soon discover that love on the frontier wasn't chosen, it was earned. The confusion born from ink and paper would ignite a storm of jealousy, loyalty, and redemption that would test the meaning of honor itself. And before the snows of winter, one truth would stand clear beneath Montana's vast sky. Even a mistake of the heart can lead a man exactly where he's meant to be. The wind swept low across the wide Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and thawing earth. Spring had come late that year, and the last of the snow still clung stubbornly to the shadows of the coulees. Luke Carver stood at the split-rail fence of his homestead, his weather-lined face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him stretched the ranch he'd carved out of wilderness, 50 head of cattle, a sturdy barn, and a 2-story cabin he'd built board by board after the war. It was more than land. It was his redemption. For 5 years, Luke had spoken only to wind and cattle, his voice gone hoarse from silence. The letters from the East had changed that. They came from Clara Weston, a schoolteacher who wrote of books, gardens, and a gentleness Luke had almost forgotten existed. He'd memorized her words by firelight, believing they were the start of a quieter kind of life. But when the stagecoach stopped that April afternoon, it wasn't only Clara who stepped down. Miriam Dale followed close behind, a tall, striking woman with the confidence of someone who'd already decided her place in the world. Both women carried letters with his signature, both certain they were the one he'd summoned across 2,000 miles of frontier. Now, as the dust settled around their boots, the man who'd spent years commanding storms and herding wild cattle found himself facing a battle of an entirely different kind, one not of bullets or branding irons, but of hearts and truth. Luke's heart pounded harder than a stampede. For a man who'd stared down raiders, rustlers, and drought, the sight of two women, claiming him as their intended bride, was somehow more terrifying. Clara Weston was first to speak, her gloved hands trembling as she held out a folded letter. "Mr. Carver," she said softly, "we've written for months. I am Clara, the woman you invited here to begin a new life." Before Luke could answer, Miriam Dale stepped forward, chin lifted high. "That's not possible," she declared, producing her own packet of letters sealed with his name. "I am Miriam Dale, and I am the woman you promised marriage to." For a long, stunned moment, the only sound was the groan of the coach wheels and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Then old Jed Harper, the coach driver, cleared his throat uneasily. "Seems your mail-order service done got its wires crossed, Luke," he muttered. Luke felt heat rise under his collar. He glanced from one woman to the other, both standing rigid in the prairie sunlight, pride and pain battling in their eyes. The letters, they were identical in tone, in phrasing, in everything but the signature. Somewhere, someone had tangled their names, turning one man's lonely hope into a cruel farce. He wanted to apologize, to fix it somehow. But what could he possibly say? There was only one cabin, only one heart. And now, two women staring at him as though their futures depended on his next word. "Ladies," Luke said finally, his voice steady but taut as a drawn lasso, "we best step inside. Seems I've got some explaining to do." Inside Luke Carver's cabin, the air felt tighter than a noose. The place smelled faintly of pine, coffee, and iron, the scent of a man who'd built his life with his own hands. Clara Weston sat on the edge of a straight-backed chair near the hearth, posture proper but eyes restless. Across from her, Miriam Dale examined the room with an assessing gaze that made even the sturdy log walls seem self-conscious. Luke poured 3 tin cups of coffee, setting them down with the same deliberate calm he used when loading a rifle. "I reckon there's been a mistake," he began. Somewhere along the trail between your letters and mine, the matchmaking service mixed up more than names. Miriam's lips curved in a sharp smile. A mistake? I crossed 2,000 miles on faith, Mr. Carver. Sold everything I owned to come here. That's not a mistake, it's betrayal. Clara flinched, her hands tightening in her lap. Please, she said softly. Let him explain. None of us wanted this. Luke rubbed his jaw. You're right, Miss Weston. None of us did. But here we are. He gestured toward the 2 trunks stacked near the door. And I don't have enough rooms for 3 souls. Miriam stood, her skirts rustling like wind through dry grass. Then you'll have to choose, she said coolly, which woman you meant to marry. The words struck like a whip. Luke's gaze hardened. That ain't something a decent man decides in 5 minutes. Maybe not, Miriam said, her tone as smooth as polished glass. But the town will decide soon enough. 2 unmarried women living under a bachelor's roof. By tomorrow, every gossip in Silver Bluff will be gnawing on our reputations. Luke's hand clenched. He'd fought rustlers who carried less poison in their threats. Clara rose, her voice trembling but firm. Mr. Carver, perhaps there's another way. If you could find someone nearby willing to host one of us just for a few days, it would give you time to think. Luke exhaled slowly, grateful for her grace. Mrs. Alma Tate, he said at last. Widow. Lives a few miles north. She helped me through my first winter here. She might take one of you in. Miriam folded her arms. How convenient. The rest of us will just wait to see who ends up with the key to your house and to your heart. Her words lingered long after she turned away. That evening, Luke saddled his horse and rode hard through the fading light toward Alma Tate's homestead. The prairie wind bit cold against his skin, but his thoughts burned hotter with every mile. He'd spent years mastering the land, learning when to fight the elements and when to yield. But this was something else. 2 women, each certain they belonged to him. 2 futures he hadn't meant to promise. By the time Alma Tate's lamp came into view, the horizon had gone black and the moon hung low. Alma was on her porch before he'd even dismounted, flour still dusting her apron. Luke Carver, she called, hands on hips. You look like a man running from the devil. Something close to it, he muttered. Inside, over strong coffee, he told her everything about the letters, the 2 names, the stagecoach mix-up. Alma listened without a sound, her sharp blue eyes cutting through his story like a plow through sod. When he finished, she leaned back and sighed. So you've got 2 brides and only 1 conscience, she said dryly. I'd call that a lesson from the Lord himself. Luke managed a weak grin. I was hoping you might take one in just for a spell while I sort this out. Alma nodded slowly. I can house one, sure. But Luke, word travels fast out here. You'll need to make your choice soon, or those women won't have a name left to protect. I know, he said, staring into the dark coffee. But how do you choose between 2 women you barely know and both believing they're your wife? Alma studied him. You don't choose with your head. You work alongside them. Watch how they meet the hard parts. The right woman will show herself when life stops being polite. Luke looked up. And what if I get it wrong? Alma's smile was faint but kind. Then you'll spend a long winter wishing you'd listened to your heart. The next morning, Luke escorted Miriam to Alma's place. She seemed none too pleased about the arrangement. Consider this a courtesy, not a dismissal, Luke said as they rode. It ain't proper for 2 ladies to share my roof. Proper, Miriam scoffed. Out here, proper means whatever keeps a man's reputation clean. Herr Bitternessstung. Luke didn't reply. Back at the ranch, Clara worked quietly, unpacking her small trunk. She found Luke's parlor tidy but sparse, no ornament, save a shelf of worn books and a faded photograph of a woman she didn't recognize. She traced the frame gently, wondering who she'd been. When Luke returned, the sun was low and shadows stretched long across the floorboards. Mrs. Tate took her in, he said simply. Thank you, Clara replied. That was merciful. They shared an awkward silence, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Finally, Luke said, You mentioned in your letters you taught children back east. I did, Clara answered. Reading, arithmetic, manners, though the last proved harder to teach than the rest. Luke chuckled quietly. Out here, manners mostly mean not shooting a man before breakfast. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Clara smiled small, uncertain, but real. Over the next days their rhythm began to form. Clara helped with chores, learning to milk, to mend, to read the weather by the way the clouds bent east. Luke found her presence steadying, quiet but sure, like rain that came gentle and stayed long. Each evening, when the day's work ended, they'd share supper and talk by the fire. She spoke of Boston, of children's laughter echoing down narrow school halls. He spoke of war, of friends buried under distant soil, and somewhere in those stories, the space between them began to shrink. But on the fourth night, as the fire burned low, Clara asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Luke," she said softly, "who was the woman in the photograph?" He stared into the flames. "Her name was Evelyn Hart. She was someone I once meant to marry." Clara's breath caught. "What happened to her?" "She vanished," he said flatly. 3 years ago. Left Denver before we were Wednesday. No word since." Clara lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." Luke nodded, but his mind was far away back in the letters that had promised him peace. The same peace that now sat across the table, unknowingly stirring his heart back to life. Meanwhile, at Alma Tate's homestead, Miriam Dale wasn't wasting time. She charmed Alma with polished conversation, helped in the kitchen, and asked carefully crafted questions about Luke's habits, his finances, his past. When Alma mentioned Evelyn Hart, Miriam's eyes flickered. "He still carries that?" she murmured. "How quaint." Alma frowned. "Careful, girl. The way a man remembers tells you more than the way he forgets." Miriam smiled thinly. "I didn't come here to study his sentiment, Mrs. Tate. I came here to build a future." By the end of the week, Luke had taken Miriam into town for supplies. The trip was polite, distant until they entered the general store. Behind the counter stood Veronica Mays, the banker's daughter, sharp-eyed and elegant as ever. Her smile froze when she saw the pair. "Mr. Carver," she said coolly. "And your companion?" Miriam's chin lifted. "Miriam Dale, Mr. Carver's fiancée." Veronica's brows arched in delight. "Oh, I hadn't realized you'd settled that matter. I was under the impression there were two." The room went still. Luke set his jaw, every eye in Silver Bluff burning into his back. "You're mistaken," he said evenly. "Just helping a friend get settled." But Miriam's smile didn't waver. "A friend today," she said sweetly. "A wife tomorrow." As they left the store, Luke's temper finally cracked. "You shouldn't have said that." "Why not? It's what you want, isn't it?" He stopped beside his wagon, meeting her defiant stare. "What I want is the truth, and I don't even know which of you wrote those letters anymore." "Does it matter?" Miriam shot back. "The woman in those letters understood you, and I could be her if you'd let me." He didn't answer, because deep down, that was the question burning in him too. That night, a rider brought a letter from the sheriff, a telegram forwarded from Denver. Evelyn Hart's name was mentioned again, tied to a man arrested for swindling women with false marriage promises. The story chilled Luke to the bone. Had Evelyn fallen victim to such a scheme? Had she been lost, not faithless? Clara found him on the porch, the letter trembling in his hands. "Is it her?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't know if it changes anything." Clara stepped closer. "It changes you, Luke. That's what matters." He looked at her then not as a guest, not as a mistake, but as a woman who saw him clear through. The next morning, he saddled up before dawn. He'd spent nights listing qualities, weighing futures like cattle at auction. But when he thought of life on the range, the cold, the loneliness, the need for warmth that wasn't just from a fire, he kept seeing Clara's face. He rode to Alma's. Miriam was waiting on the porch, already dressed as if for a wedding that hadn't been announced. He told her gently, but directly, that his heart lay elsewhere. Miriam's composure cracked for only a moment, a tremor, a flash of disbelief before her smile returned, hard and brittle. "Then I hope your Miss Weston knows what to do with a man who can't tell his own heart till someone else points it out." Alma watched from the doorway as Miriam's carriage departed later that day. "Hard truth," she murmured, "but a clean one." Luke nodded. "The only kind worth living with." He rode back home through the wind, dust swirling behind him like smoke from a battle finally done. Clara was in the garden, sleeves rolled up, hands buried in the soil. She looked up, smiling faintly. Luke dismounted, walked to her side, and knelt beside her in the dirt. "You said once that gardening teaches patience," he said. "I reckon I've finally learned it." Clara met his eyes. "And what's grown from it?" "Something I didn't expect," Luke replied, voice low. "A reason to stay." As the sun climbed above the prairie, the man who'd once written to a stranger realized that the truest letters were never sent on paper. They were written in the way two people met the world together. And from that day on, the ranch no longer felt empty. The thaw broke hard. 3 days after Luke chose Clara in the honest light of morning, the weather turned mean, and the sky rolled in blue-black like a bruise. Wind hammered the eaves, and the cottonwoods along the creek rattled their bones. Luke stacked more wood by the hearth and checked the rifle over the mantel. Clara tied back her hair and set a pot of venison stew to simmer, the scent of thyme and pepper drifting through the room like a promise that winter was finally losing its grip. By late afternoon, the wind had calmed, but the quiet felt wrong, too sudden, too complete. Luke stepped onto the porch just as a lone rider crested the slope, coat torn by travel, hat gone, hair whipped loose. He knew that face even before she lifted her own, Evelyn Hart. A dozen thoughts collided in him: shock, relief, an old ache that had never quite quit its fussing, then steadied into something calmer than he expected. He had imagined this moment beneath 1,000 different skies. Not once had he pictured it with Clara's soft footsteps behind him. Evelyn slid from the saddle and stumbled. Luke caught her forearm. "Easy," he said. She searched his eyes like a woman counting stars she'd learned by heart. "Luke," she breathed, voice raw. "I had to find you. He's out. He knows about the ranch." Clara reached the doorway, apron dusted with flour. For a heartbeat, she and Evelyn regarded one another, two histories of the same man crossing like wagon tracks at a lonely junction. "Come inside," Clara said gently. "You're frozen." Evelyn drank her stew like someone learning warmth again. Her hands trembled around the tin bowl. Up close, Clara saw the story travel had written on her cracked lips, raw knuckles, a square of fabric sewn twice at the collar. She was not the fine-boned girl in Luke's faded photograph. She was harder now and somehow more human. Luke listened without moving as Evelyn spoke. "His name is James Forsyth," she began. "I met him on the coach 3 years ago, when I was bound for you. He said he knew you, said he'd done business with the ranchers up here. Warned me that the man I was coming to marry had gotten himself into trouble with a claim jumper, and that there'd be a gun waiting with my name on it. I was a fool. I believed him." Her mouth twisted. "He took the money my aunt left me, said he'd get me safely to a cousin in Cheyenne. He vanished at a way station with my trunks. By the time I understood, I couldn't bear to write you to tell you I'd traded our future for a lie." Luke's fingers tightened on his knee, the only sign that the old wound had flared. "Why not come anyway?" he asked, not accusing needing the fact of it. "I tried," Evelyn said. "Then shame built its own walls. I took work at a school under a borrowed name. I told myself you'd marry, that your life was better without a woman who'd chosen fear." She drew a breath that failed to steady her. "But 2 weeks ago, Forsyth was released on bond after a judge's pockets got heavier. He started looking for past investments. Word reached me that he'd asked after the woman once bound for a Montana rancher, the one who owed him for mercy. He wasn't after me, Luke. He was after you, your cattle, your land, anything he could take to square his ledger of pride." Luke's jaw flexed. "You think he's riding this way?" "I know it," she said. "He has 3 men with him. He'll call it debt. He'll make it look legal enough to keep the sheriff slow." Clara found her own voice then. "Why warn us?" Evelyn met her gaze with a steadiness that surprised Clara. "Because the map I followed to ruin had your man's name at the end of it. I won't let him draw the same line through you." She glanced at the hearth, where the fire wore itself down to coals. "If I've learned anything, it's that shame is a poor architect. I won't build with it anymore." Clara nodded slowly, feeling something soften in the knot she hadn't even admitted to. "Then we plan," she said, turning to Luke. "Tonight." Luke rose. The decision in him felt clean as cold water. "We plan." They set the house like a chessboard. Luke checked ammunition, oiled the Winchester, and set spare cartridges along the windowsill. Clara moved quiet and certain, thinking in lines and angles, Lamp here, bucket there, the thick wool blanket folded near the door in case of fire. She lifted the floorboard in the pantry. Luke had showed her on the third night his small stash of coin, and packed it into a flour sack, then tucked the sack behind the piano, sliding the instrument an inch to hide the fresh scuff. Evelyn sketched a crude map of the approach trails on the back of an old ledger page. "He likes to show power, not skill," she said, tapping a finger along the south fence line. "He'll come where you can see him, claim authority he doesn't have. His men will flank under cover of dark." "Sheriff Dalton?" Luke asked. "Riding the rail spur for a prisoner transfer," Evelyn said. "Forsyth knew it." Luke cursed softly. "Then it's ours to hold." Clara straightened. "We don't need heroics," she said. "We need neighbors." Luke shook his head. "Most have families within earshot. I won't invite stray bullets into their kitchens." "Then we make noise they can't ignore," Clara countered. "If this turns ugly, someone will saddle up." Luke considered her for a long breath, this woman who'd arrived with a trunk and gentleness, and was now distilling fear into tasks. "You'll not stand in a window," he said. "I'll stand where you need me," she replied, unflinching. Evelyn smiled faintly. "He doesn't know you," she told Clara. "That's his mistake." By night, the sky had cleared to hammered silver. Frost crackled underfoot, and every sound snapped sharp as glass. Luke posted them. Evelyn, upstairs by the north window. Clara in the small pantry alcove guarding the back door with Alma's old scattergun Luke kept for snakes. He took the front room. They didn't wait long. Hoofbeats, 4 sets, slow and theatrical, came up the south trail. When they reached the yard, a voice called out, "Too smooth," the kind of smooth that rides on oil and leaves stains. "Evening, Mr. Carver. James Forsyth. I believe you have something of mine." Luke opened the front door and stepped onto the porch with the Winchester easy in his hands. "I've got a windmill, a barn, and 50 head," he said. "None of it bears your brand." Laughter. "A woman, Mr. Carver. One who made me certain promises." Luke felt Clara's presence behind the wall like a heartbeat. "Whatever she promised, I can promise you this. There won't be any business done at this door tonight." Forsyth nudged his horse a pace closer. Moonlight revealed a handsome face gone sour with entitlement. His hat was trimmed too fine for a man who'd earned it in honest weather. "No need for rudeness," he said lightly. "We'll take the stock against what I'm owed, and I'll sign a note saying you're squared." "You'll take what the law gives you," Luke said. "And since the law isn't home, you'll take my answer instead." Forsyth's smile thinned. "Men like you have an odd loyalty to things that don't pay in cash." He lifted 2 fingers, and shadow peeled from the cottonwoods on either side, his men sliding forward like bad ideas. Upstairs, a window clicked as Evelyn braced her pistol on the sill. In the pantry, Clara steadied the shotgun, her breath controlled and slow. "Last chance," Forsyth said, voice still polite. "Send Miss Hart out, saddle a dozen head, and put a signature where I tell you. I'll even leave you your piano." Luke's reply was measured, the same voice he used with skittish colts. "Ride on." The man to Forsyth's left raised a rifle. Evelyn shot him through the arm before he could sight. He howled, weapon clattering to the yard. Everything happened at once. Forsyth wheeled, shouted, "Luke fired," splintering the post inches from Forsyth's knee. Clara swung the back door open and leveled both barrels at the second flanker, creeping along the shadow of the cabin. Her voice rang out, firm and country clear. "Drop it, or I ruin your winter." The man glanced up and froze, not at the shotgun, at the woman holding it. He wasn't staring at an ornament in a parlor, he was staring at someone who meant to keep a home alive. He dropped the gun. Forsyth cursed, spurring toward the porch. Luke stepped off the top stair, closing the distance with controlled fury. The horses snorted, eyes rolling white at the muzzle flashes. Forsyth swung a wild butt of his pistol. Luke slipped it, brought the Winchester stock across his wrist, and sent the pistol skidding across the yard. The third man charged from the dark. A scatter of gravel under Clara's boots warned Luke a half-breath before the knife flashed. Luke pivoted, the blade cut cloth, then air. He drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, heard the breath leave him in a bark, and shoved him sprawling. Evelyn's next shot punched the night like punctuation. "Enough," she shouted, voice breaking on the old shame and the new courage threaded in it. "You robbed me once, you won't rob him." Forsyth didn't answer with words. He kicked his horse hard and lunged for the open door. Clara met him at the threshold, a stovehook in her hands. She swung low, catching his shin. He pitched forward, and Luke caught him by the collar and planted him face first in the packed dirt yard. Silence tumbled down. Only the horses blew steam, and the wounded man groaned where he crouched, clutching his arm. Luke hauled Forsyth to his feet. "You'll ride out," he said, voice quiet enough to be serious. "You'll take your men, and you'll leave a message at Silver Bluff for Sheriff Dalton telling him exactly what happened here tonight. If you don't, we will." Forsyth spat blood into the dirt. The polite mask had stripped away, revealing something petty and small. "You think this is done, rancher? I don't need guns to ruin you." Evelyn descended the stairs and moved into the yard, pale in the moonlight. "He'll try the bank," she said to Luke. "Notes and legal threats. He'll smell where a crack can be widened." Forsyth smiled again, and this time the smile looked like a nail. "At least someone here understands how the world works." Luke bound the injured man's arm with a strip of torn shirt, more for his own conscience than their enemy's comfort. "Ride," he said. Forsyth mounted. At the turn of the yard he pulled up and looked back, tipping his hat with theatrical courtesy. "Pleasure, Miss Hart." His gaze slid to Clara, and for the first time a flicker of something uneasy crossed his face as if he understood, too late, that he had misjudged the geometry of this house. "See you at the bank, Mr. Carver." They watched the riders shrink into the blue field of night until sound thinned to nothing. Luke exhaled a breath he felt like he'd held for years. Clara lowered the shotgun. Evelyn rubbed her wrists, as if she could wipe away fingerprints from the past. "Thank you," Luke said to both women. He meant it in a dozen ways. Morning brought visitors, as Clara had predicted. A neighbor boy had seen the gun flashes and roused his father, and by sunrise 2 ranchers were on the porch with coffee and offers to ride into town to alert the sheriff. While they saddled up, Alma Tate arrived with her hair pinned high like a battle standard and a sack of biscuits. Clara swore weighed as much as iron ore. "I heard the wind carried foolishness last night," Alma said, eyes sweeping the yard. She spotted Evelyn and paused, a dozen calculations clicking behind her gaze. Then she nodded once, clear-eyed. "So you're the old ache." She thrust her hand. "Alma Tate." Evelyn's lips quirked. "Evelyn Hart. The ache has grown up some." Alma snorted. "Good. We're fresh out of room for girls who faint when a door slams." Over breakfast, the talk turned practical. Sheriff Dalton would be back by evening. In the meantime, Alma said, "You've got to head him off at the bank." Clara glanced at Luke. "Veronica Mays's father," she said. "He'll listen to Forsyth if it smells like money." Luke grimaced. "Herbert Mays has wanted my south pasture under his thumb since the drought 2 summers ago." "I'll go," Evelyn said. "You'll not," Luke answered. "He's already used your name to make threats look like contracts." "Then I'll go," Clara said. "With Alma." Luke looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know," she cut in gently. "I want to. You hold the ranch. I'll hold the line he can't see." Evelyn nodded approval, and Alma was already shrugging into her coat. "Get your bonnet, girl. We're due an argument in polished wood." Silver Bluff's bank was all brass rails and plush rugs, and the sort of quiet that mistakes itself for respect. Herbert Mays looked up from his high desk when Alma and Clara entered, his expression schooled to mild surprise. Veronica stood near the ledger cabinet, dark hair smooth as horse satin, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mrs. Tate," Herbert said. "Miss Weston," Clara supplied. "I'm here on behalf of Luke Carver." "Luke can speak for himself," Herbert replied with a smile that showed too many polished teeth. "He always has." "Last night James Forsyth attempted to extort his stock," Clara said. "No preamble, no apology." "He failed. He'll try paper next." Herbert's smile didn't quite fade. It just cooled. "If Mr. Forsyth presents a claim with signatures attached—" "There are no signatures," Alma cut in. "Only a man's pride and a handful of threats." Veronica's gaze sharpened. "Forsyth was here this morning," she said, ignoring her father's small frown. "He hinted at an arrangement stock against a note. I told him we don't traffic in gossip or coercion. Herbert's head turned sharply. Veronica. What? She said, meeting Clara's eyes in a way that felt like an alliance offered. We're not a saloon ledger. We're a bank. Herbert recovered with a cluck of his tongue. My daughter is idealistic. The bank deals in documents, not drama. If Forsyth files a lien, Clara stepped forward. Then you can choose what kind of institution you are. A man arriving in the dead of night with 3 guns doesn't acquire legitimate claims by daybreak. If you bless his paper, the town will read it as a blessing on robbery. Alma leaned in on a stiff elbow. And the town's ranchers will remember that blessing when they choose where to keep their winter money. Herbert's face pinched. Is that a threat? It's arithmetic, Alma replied sweetly. Silence fell. Then Veronica spoke quietly. Father, Sheriff Dalton will be back by evening. If you file anything on Forsyth, say, so before then, you'll make enemies we don't need. Herbert weighed the room, the name Carver, the hands that fed his ledgers every month. At last he sighed, a man choosing profit under the flag of principle. Very well. No notes filed without the sheriff's review. Clara breathed slow, unclenching. Thank you. Herbert waved a hand, already mentally redrawing his ledger lines. You can tell Mr. Carver that for today, at least, his property remains his. Outside, Alma squinted into the winter Sunday. You've got a tongue like a plowshare, she told Clara. Cuts a straight furrow. Clara smiled, surprised by the warmth that rose in her at the compliment. Straight is the only way I know. Veronica stepped onto the boardwalk behind them. Miss Weston, she said, and Clara turned. The banker's daughter hesitated. I misjudged him, Veronica admitted, meaning Luke. Thought like my father property first, people when convenient. Perhaps I misjudged you too. Clara studied her. In another life, Veronica would be the sort of woman Clara avoided by instinct. But the frontier rearranged categories the way wind arranged snow. Nothing stayed in the drifts you expected. We're all educating each other out here, Clara said. Some of us learn faster. A laugh ghosted over Veronica's mouth. Tell Luke I meant what I said at the desk. The bank won't be a cudgel, not while I have breath to say it. Sheriff Dalton arrived with dusk, boots still dusty from the rail spur. He listened to Luke's recounting, Evelyn's testimony, and Alma's report from town. When he heard that Forsyth had drawn men on a private yard, he nodded once, the kind of nod that precedes paperwork and handcuffs. Hard cases make bad judges, he said, but they make quick deputies. He rose. I'll collect him. Careful, Luke said. He'll reach for templates before he reaches for a gun. Dalton smiled thinly. So do I. He found Forsyth at the boarding house, all starch and feigned outrage, a man aggrieved at the very suggestion of malice. Dalton took him anyway, on charges of attempted theft under color of law. It would hold long enough to fetch a federal man from Miles City who liked his lines straight. When the door closed behind the sheriff and his prisoner, the tension in Luke's shoulders released like thawing wire. He turned and found Evelyn on the porch step, her hands folded loosely, her eyes on the cottonwoods. Thank you, he said. For what? She asked softly. For turning your horse this way when you could have kept going. Evelyn smiled, small and clean. I owed more than I could carry. It was time to lay something down. She looked past him to where Clara stood in the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, the light from the hearth gilding her hair. She's the right one, Evelyn said simply. I knew when she put a spoon in my hand like I was family. Luke swallowed. Even now, the part of him that had loved a future with Evelyn brushed up against memory like a horse against an old fence habit, not hunger. Are you all right? She finished. I think so. She faced him fully, a woman whose edges were no longer fear's work. I loved you once, Luke, or I loved the life I imagined with you. That dream was a fine thing, and it carried me when I deserved nothing so kind, but I don't belong to it anymore. She nodded toward the dark smudge of town. The children in that school do. So do I. He nodded, a benediction neither of them had words big enough to give back. You'll stay tonight, he said. Alma will drive you in the morning. Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. I came on a trail I should have taken years ago. I'd like to finish it by my own hand. She held out her palm. He took it. For a moment there was only the human warmth of forgiveness, fear shucked like an old skin, and the future standing up straight. "Goodbye, Luke." "Goodbye, Evelyn." She swung into the saddle and rode toward the moonlit flats, a small figure stitching herself back into the world. Clara stepped onto the porch as the hoofbeats faded. They stood side by side in the sharp, kind air. "I watched you let a ghost go," she said. Luke's breath fogged and thinned. "I didn't know I was holding it," he admitted. "That's how ghosts work," Clara answered. "The living are the ones who notice the weight." He turned to her. The words he'd used earlier in the week felt insufficient now. "Clara Weston," he said, and her name sounded like it had always been meant for this place. "I chose you because the days made sense beside you. Tonight I choose you because the hard hours do, too." She laughed a sound like thaw, then quieted. "I'm not made of miracles," she said, "just stubbornness and the wish to build." "That's a miracle enough on this land," he said. From the yard, Alma cleared her throat, scandalized in jest. "If you two are fixing to make declarations, you might invite a chaperone or a preacher." "Tomorrow," Luke called back, grinning despite himself. "Tonight I'm just counting what didn't get taken." Alma harumphed, satisfied. "Then count each other twice," she said, and went inside. Clara slipped her hand into Luke's. Their fingers found the fit that work and weather had made for them. In the dark, the ranch settled, a long creature finding rest. Beyond the cottonwoods, the creek kept its promises of spring, whispering the same truth it told every stubborn shoot: grow anyway. Inside, the piano still hid a sack of coin, the pantry smelled of spice and flour, and the window glass held the faintest handmade ripples that bent moonlight into water. Everything ordinary had survived the extraordinary. That, Clara thought, was the quiet definition of a life worth guarding. Luke squeezed her hand once more. "Tomorrow we speak to Reverend Collins," he said. "Not because of last night, but because of every morning I want." Clara nodded, and for the first time since stepping off the stage, she let herself imagine a future with colors. Instead of edges, the garden rose straight and sure, the table set for more than one, the sound of a man's boots returning at dusk, and the brush of his hand on her shoulder, as natural as breath. The night held, the ranch breathed, and far off, where the road to Silver Bluff straightened into a streak of pale dust, a figure on horseback disappeared toward the sunrise she'd earned. By noon the next day, Sheriff Dalton wired Miles City. By sundown, Veronica Mays quietly convinced her father to post a notice. No claims filed against the Carver ranch without court order. The paper on the bank door fluttered in the wind like a white flag that someone had finally learned to hold up in time. When Alma hitched her wagon to return to town, she pressed a folded scrap into Clara's palm, a crooked list written in blunt pencil. Flour, 10 pounds. Sugar, 4 pounds. Salt pork. Coffee, for heaven's sake. Ribbon. Blue. Don't argue, man needs color. Clara laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Alma kissed her temple in the swift, unpracticed way of a woman who thought tenderness was best delivered like orders. "Bring your list tomorrow, child," she said. "We'll start a household with more than coffee. We'll start it with sense." Luke watched them from the porch, smiling at a scene he hadn't known how to want 3 years ago. An old friend bossing a future he trusted. The woman he loved arguing amiably about ribbon. He felt the long line of loneliness that had trailed him like a second shadow falter and break. "Tomorrow," he said under his breath, and the word landed light. That evening, as a slant of gold crossed the floorboards, and the stew pot gave up its last slow bubbles, Luke opened the piano and pulled out the flour sack. He set it on the table and unknotted the cord, the coins bright as summer in his palm. "Wedding money," he said. Clara's mouth shaped surprise, and then the small smile he'd come to measure his days by. "And seed," she added, practical to the last. "For the second garden. We'll need summer squash, and good beans, and sweet corn," he finished. "Enough to teach children to get lost in." "Children?" she echoed, not testing him, tasting the word. He looked up. "If we're blessed," he said simply. Clara reached across the table and tapped 3 coins into a small pile. "That's for ribbon," she said, and he laughed so hard he had to put his head down on his arms. The wind turned gentle at the windows. Outside, the cottonwoods made a sound like a dress being shaken out, and the creek told its stubborn truth again. Grow anyway. And so, under a sky that had finally decided on spring, a mistake made by strangers had bent into a future chosen by two people who had earned it. The next morning dawned clear and tender, the air smelling of thawed soil and pine resin. The world felt scrubbed clean as if the storm, the gunfire, and all the tangled years behind Luke Carver had been washed away overnight. The ranch stood quiet, except for the hum of cattle, lowing in the distant pasture, the rhythm of a land beginning again. Luke rose early, as always. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't weigh on him. He brewed coffee, stepped onto the porch, and watched the sunlight spill over the ridges. Behind him came the soft rustle of skirts. Clara, still sleepy, her hair loose over her shoulders. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she answered, taking the tin cup from his hand. "Feels different today." "It is," Luke said, gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's honest now." They stood together, the wind tugging gently at Clara's shawl. Down by the corral, Alma Tate was already fussing with the hitch post, directing two neighbors who'd come to mend what last night's trouble had splintered. Evelyn's saddle was gone, her trail long since pointed east. A note she'd left behind rested on the kitchen table, brief and final. "Thank you for forgiving what I couldn't face. May your home be louder than my silence ever was." Clara had read it twice, tears smudging the edge of the paper. Now, she pressed her fingers around Luke's. "She found her way," she murmured. "So did I," he said. By mid-morning the yard had turned into quiet industry. Men repaired the gate. Alma bossed them like a field marshal. Sheriff Dalton rode up with news that Forsyth was on a train to stand trial in Denver, and not likely to sweet-talk his way out this time. Veronica Mays had sent word that the bank ledger had been corrected, the Carver ranch marked "cleared and free." Luke tipped his hat. "Appreciate you, Sheriff." Dalton smiled. "You've done half my job, Carver. Might want to run for deputy." Luke laughed. "Reckon I've got a ranch full of trouble already." As Dalton departed, Alma strode up with her usual mix of warmth and command. "Well, I suppose I'll need to fetch Reverend Collins this afternoon," she said, pretending nonchalance, "since a certain couple's been playing house, without the paperwork to make it decent." Clara flushed. "Alma?" "What?" Alma grinned. "You think the Lord can't see past your kitchen curtains? He's been waiting on that wedding longer than the rest of us." Luke chuckled, touching the brim of his hat. "If the Reverend's willing, I won't argue." That afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the cottonwoods, Reverend Collins arrived with his worn Bible and the calm patience of a man who'd seen 100 beginnings and a few miracles in between. They held the ceremony under the open sky, the same sky that had watched their fear, their fight, and their forgiveness. Clara wore a simple cream dress Alma had tailored from linen, her hair tied with a ribbon of blue. Luke stood in his cleanest shirt, boots polished, face solemn until she met his eyes, and then, for once, the stoic rancher broke into an unguarded smile. Neighbors gathered quietly, the wind their only music. Alma dabbed her eyes while pretending she was wiping dust. Veronica arrived with a basket of wildflowers. Even the cattle at the fence line seemed to pause, their heavy heads turned toward the gathering as if paying respect. When the Reverend spoke the vows, Luke's voice carried steady through the still air. "I built this land with my hands," he said, "but I was never its owner till you stepped on it." Clara's reply trembled with feeling. "I came here chasing survival, but I found something worth living for." They sealed the vows with a kiss gentle and sure, a quiet thing made large by the world around it. The crowd cheered, and Alma declared loudly, "About time," her voice setting off laughter that rolled like thunder across the prairie. That night, the ranch glowed with lamplight and music. Julia Dale's piano, no longer a symbol of competition but of endurance, filled the room with warm, imperfect chords. Luke and Clara danced barefoot on the wooden floor, the laughter of their guests mingling with the hum of cicadas outside. Later, when the house had gone still again, Luke walked Clara out to the porch. The moon hung wide and forgiving, the air cool and alive. "Never thought a mistake could lead to this," he said softly. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "Most good things come by accident," she whispered. "We just have to be brave enough to keep them." Luke slipped an arm around her. "Then we'll keep it," he said. "All of it, the hard winters, the soft mornings, even the storms. We'll build our years from them. Below, the creek ran clear again, carrying the melted snow toward the valley where the new garden waited for seed. A candle flickered in the window, its glow faint but steadfast. Luke kissed Clara's temple, and the sound of her laughter quiet, unafraid, rose into the open Montana night, like the first hymn of spring. Spring came slow but steady to the Carver ranch. By May, the last of the snow had melted into the creek, feeding rows of green that reached toward the Sunday. The land once scarred by drought and silence breathed again, alive with the rhythm of hooves, laughter, and the clink of tools in honest work. Luke stood at the fence line one morning, the same place where months ago he'd watched a stagecoach approach, his heart full of hope and doubt. The memory felt distant now, like another man's story. Behind him came Clara's voice, warm as sunlight. "The beans are sprouting," she said, setting a basket of laundry on the porch rail. "They'll do fine," Luke replied, "so long as they've got enough light." Clara smiled knowingly. Everything does eventually. They shared a quiet look, the kind that needed no words. From town came word that Evelyn Hart had opened her own schoolhouse near Cheyenne, teaching orphaned children for little more than room and board. The sheriff wrote once to say that Forsyth had been sentenced to hard labor, his silver tongue finally out-talked by the truth. Veronica Mays and Julia Dale had begun organizing reading circles for the ranch wives of Silver Bluff, turning what once was gossip into learning. Even Alma Tate, unyielding, loud-hearted Alma, had agreed to serve as midwife for the first of many little Carvers, as she'd put it, winking at Clara until the younger woman blushed crimson. The world, Clara thought, had a way of mending itself when people chose decency over pride. That evening, Luke came in from the pasture, dust on his boots and the smell of sage on his coat. He stopped by the doorway, watching Clara hang a lamp above the table. Its light brushed across her face, soft and sure. "You ever think," he said quietly, "about how one mistake started all this?" Clara laughed gently. "Then maybe we owe our happiness to a mix-up and a bit of mercy." "Ho." Luke stepped forward, wrapping an arm around her waist. "No," he said. "We owe it to choosing right when it counted." Outside, the sky burned gold, fading into violet. The piano in the corner caught the last rays, its polished wood gleaming like memory. As they stood together in the doorway, the wind carried the scent of rain and turned the grass into waves. The frontier stretched endless before them, harsh, vast, unforgiving, but to Luke and Clara Carver, it was home. And in that boundless country where chance had played its hand and love had answered, their story settled quietly into legend, the tale of a mix-up that made two lonely souls whole again beneath the wide Montana sky.